She had been invited to a small gathering at a friend's apartment, a place she had never been before. The streets leading there were quiet, lined with old trees that swayed lightly in the afternoon breeze. She walked slowly, taking in the familiar comfort of the air around her. Even though her stomach was fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves, she was not usually one to seek attention, and yet there was something about this invitation that felt different. It was casual, meant to be fun, nothing serious, and that relaxed tone gave her a bit of courage as she reached the door. The sounds of laughter and chatter floated out to greet her. The host opened the door with a welcoming smile, and she stepped inside, feeling immediately the warmth of the room. There were only a handful of people gathered, some sitting on couches, others perched on the edges of chairs, talking in low voices. The walls were decorated with simple art, personal and inviting, and the soft hum of a playlist in the background added to the cozy atmosphere. She placed her coat on a hook and tried to find a place for herself, moving carefully so as not to interrupt the flow of conversations. A friend spotted her and waved her over, motioning her to come closer. She felt a small smile spread across her face as she made her way through the room. Conversations paused briefly as she approached, just enough for her presence to be acknowledged. She greeted everyone with a quiet, friendly nod. Feeling a little shy, but at ease in the company of people who seemed genuinely glad to see her, the host, noticing her attention to detail and the careful way she took in the room, leaned in slightly and said, "There's a piano in the corner if you feel like playing something," it was said casually, almost as if it were a passing suggestion, a way to fill the room with music if the mood called for it. She looked over and saw the piano, simple but well kept, standing quietly as if waiting for someone to bring it to life. Her first thought was hesitation. She had played the piano since she was a child, though mostly in the privacy of her own room. The idea of playing in front of a small audience, even friends, made her heart beat faster. She smiled politely, not immediately responding. "Maybe," she said softly, unsure if she could do it. The host's eyes twinkled with encouragement. "Just for fun," they added. No pressure. That phrase, "just for fun," settled something inside her. It reminded her of why she loved music in the first place. Not for recognition, not for praise, but simply for the joy of it. She nodded slowly and made her way to the piano. As she walked, she felt the slight tremble in her fingers, the nervous excitement that always came before a performance. No matter how informal, when she sat on the bench, she took a deep breath and placed her hands lightly on the keys. The room felt a little different from this perspective, quieter somehow, as if it had been waiting for music to fill it. She started with a simple tune, something familiar, letting the notes flow gently. The first sounds were soft, almost hesitant, but each note felt more confident than the last. The casual conversations continued around her, but she felt herself slowly pulling attention without meaning to. People began to notice the change in the atmosphere. Some paused mid-conversation, listening with interest. Others leaned slightly toward the piano, curious about the melody that was weaving itself into the room. She kept playing, her fingers moving with a mix of instinct and memory, letting the music carry her rather than trying to control it. The simple tunes she played brought smiles to faces and a quiet calm that was tangible. She remembered the times she had played alone in her room, the long afternoons spent trying to perfect a song that she would never perform for anyone else. The notes had always been a comfort, a place where she could express feelings too complex for words. Now, as she played for the room, the same feelings surfaced, stronger and more vivid. There was a connection forming not just between her and the piano, but between her and the people listening. Even if they did not speak, one person whispered to another a soft comment about how lovely it sounded, and she felt a small spark of confidence. She kept her eyes slightly lowered, focusing on the keys, letting the music guide her rather than the audience. Each phrase she played seemed to draw them in further, and she could feel the room holding its breath with her. The energy was gentle, but unmistakable, a shared moment of beauty and attention that needed no words as she played. Memories of her childhood lessons came to mind, the patience, the hours of practice, the small triumphs when a piece finally felt right. She realized that all of those moments had led to this instant. This simple gathering where her music could touch others without expectation. There was no stage, no lights, no formal audience. Yet it felt important, meaningful. And she allowed herself to enjoy the sensation of giving life to the notes. The melody shifted slightly, becoming a little more playful, as if she were teasing the piano into speaking new ideas. Fingers danced lightly across the keys, exploring variations, little improvisations that brought warmth to the room. People who had been watching quietly began to nod subtly, exchanging glances that acknowledged the skill and heart in her playing. Even those who had come to talk found themselves drawn in, their conversations pausing as they absorbed the music. She noticed a young man sitting cross-legged on the floor, his attention fully captured by the sound. His eyes reflected surprise and admiration, and she allowed herself a tiny smile, acknowledging the connection. It was not about applause or recognition, but about the moment itself, the shared experience of sound and silence. The piano became an extension of her thoughts, expressing feelings that had no easy words. Her confidence grew with each passing minute, and she started to play with more freedom. Mistakes, if any, were brushed aside, for they seemed natural in the flow of the music. The room responded subtly, the energy shifting from casual to attentive, from ordinary to captivated. She could feel it in the way people leaned in, the quiet breaths that punctuated the pauses, and the gentle hum of appreciation that lingered in the air. She paused briefly, letting a soft chord resonate before continuing. The moment of silence that followed was filled with anticipation rather than emptiness. She began again, weaving a melody that was both familiar and new, a personal story told in notes and rhythm. Her hands moved with a fluidity that surprised her, and she realized she was no longer thinking about the room or the people, only about the music itself. As the afternoon sunlight shifted through the windows, it cast warm patterns across the room and piano. She noticed the way the light touched the keys and reflected off the polished surface, enhancing the feeling of intimacy and calm. The room seemed to pause with her, a perfect alignment of moment, music, and emotion. She allowed herself to sink fully into the experience. Forgetting any self-consciousness or hesitation, she remembered her first public performance at a school recital, the fear and exhilaration mingling in a way that had been both terrifying and thrilling. Now, in this casual setting, the same thrill was present but softened, gentler, and more satisfying. She felt a deep sense of joy, the kind that comes from creating something real and meaningful. Even in the simplest circumstances, people started to lean closer to hear more clearly. Drawn in by the authenticity of her playing, they weren't evaluating or judging, only listening, letting the sound carry them into the moment. She played piece after piece, transitioning naturally from one to another. Each melody telling a small story, a fragment of emotion. The room felt alive in a quiet, delicate way. Every listener caught in the gentle current of sound. Some of the attendees whispered softly to each other, commenting on the skill and grace of her fingers, the way the music seemed to fill more than just the physical space. She could sense the admiration, yet it never felt like pressure. Instead, it became an invisible encouragement, urging her to continue exploring the melodies that flowed from her mind and heart. The music brought back memories of family gatherings, where someone had always played the piano and everyone else had gathered around to listen. Those memories were tinged with warmth and nostalgia. They mingled with the present, enriching the emotion of her performance. She realized that music had always been her language, a way to connect without words. And now, it was connecting her to people she had just met. Minutes turned into longer spans of time, but she hardly noticed. The room seemed to exist outside of ordinary schedules, focused only on the conversation between her hands and the piano. Each chord, each melody, built upon the last, weaving a tapestry of sound that held attention effortlessly. She felt a lightness, a sense of being fully present, and the nervousness that had been there at the start had melted away. By the time she played her final few notes, a quiet hush had fallen over the room. Conversations had stopped entirely, replaced by a shared stillness that was almost reverent. She allowed the last chord to linger, letting it fade naturally, and then slowly lifted her hands from the keys. The silence was complete for just a moment before the room began to stir again, softly at first, then more audibly as people started to speak in whispers of admiration and gentle smiles. She looked up, surprised at the attention, and realized that what had started as a casual suggestion to play for fun had grown into something far more meaningful. The experience was unexpected, a small, perfect moment that she would carry with her for a long time. She felt a mix of pride and humility, the deep satisfaction of having shared a part of herself through music, and the realization that sometimes the simplest invitations can lead to the most memorable experiences. After the first few songs, she felt a gentle shift in the room. The casual chatter that had filled the space before was now replaced by quiet attention. People leaned slightly forward, their faces softened, eyes following her hands as they moved across the keys. The initial hesitation had faded from her movements, replaced by a rhythm that seemed to grow naturally with each passing note. The music no longer felt like a casual performance. It felt alive, almost as if it had a heartbeat of its own. She chose her next piece carefully, something that she had practiced often but never felt brave enough to play in front of others. As she began, the melody floated gently through the room, weaving around the listeners. The soft harmonies seemed to fill not just the space, but the minds and hearts of those present. People who had been leaning back lazily on the couch were now sitting upright, attentive, their eyes fixed on the piano as if it held the answers to questions they hadn't asked. Her fingers moved with a quiet confidence, brushing the keys lightly, then pressing with more emphasis where the music demanded. The room became immersed in sound, the hum of background noise disappearing completely. One by one, faces turned toward her, expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine awe. She noticed the slight widening of eyes, the subtle catch of breath, and the way some listeners exchanged quick glances as if to silently confirm what they were all feeling. She played a familiar tune, but as her fingers danced across the keys, she added little variations that made it feel fresh. The music seemed to breathe, stretching and contracting naturally, carrying emotion through each note. The small improvisations she added made the performance feel intimate and personal. She realized she was no longer thinking about how people were watching. She was thinking only of the music, letting it guide her hands and heart together. A few people began to whisper softly to each other, marveling at her ability to create such a moving sound from a casual piano. One person quietly said, "I didn't know she could play like this," and others nodded, their expressions a mixture of surprise and delight. Even those who rarely paid attention to music seemed captivated, caught by the honesty and skill in her performance. As she moved into the next piece, the music deepened. She played with more emotion, letting the melody carry a hint of longing and joy intertwined. The rhythm was fluid, neither rushed nor slow, holding the listeners in a gentle sway. Every note seemed deliberate yet effortless, a product of years of practice meeting genuine passion. She could feel the energy in the room shifting, subtle but undeniable. A collective experience forming between her and the audience. She glanced briefly at the people around her. There were no phones recording, no cameras watching, only people present in the moment, listening. That realization filled her with warmth. The music was connecting them all in a way that words could not. She smiled faintly, feeling a surge of courage. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to really play. Without hesitation or fear of making mistakes, her next melody was slightly more complex, requiring careful attention and precise finger placement. She welcomed the challenge, feeling the excitement of mastering the notes under the gaze of the attentive audience. Each chord resonated clearly, blending with the softer notes to create a rich texture that filled every corner of the room. She felt the sound around her, almost tactile, a living presence that responded to her touch. The room seemed to shrink around the music, people drawing closer in their minds, if not physically, focused entirely on the sound. Conversations ceased completely, replaced by soft breathing and the occasional shift in position as listeners leaned in for a better experience. Even those who were initially skeptical or distant were now engaged. Drawn in by the sincerity of her performance, A woman sitting near the piano had her hand resting lightly on her chin, her eyes wide with amazement. She whispered something to the person beside her, pointing subtly at the piano, sharing the wonder she felt. The energy in the room was tangible, an invisible thread connecting everyone to the music. She noticed it too, the way a single note seemed to ripple across the space. Touching each listener differently, but equally powerfully, she continued, her fingers now moving with a fluidity that surprised her. The nervousness that had accompanied her earlier in the evening had disappeared completely. She felt a sense of liberation, a joy in giving something meaningful to others without expectation. Each piece she played carried a story, a little fragment of emotion that reached into the hearts of her audience. The room responded with quiet admiration, the subtle movements, expressions reflecting their appreciation. She paused briefly between pieces, letting a soft chord linger in the air. The room remained silent, almost holding its breath. That stillness was part of the magic. The shared recognition that something beautiful was happening, a moment suspended in time. She smiled to herself, feeling both pride and humility. The music had become a bridge, connecting her with the people in ways words never could. Choosing her next piece, she decided on one that was playful and light, a contrast to the deeper emotions of the previous tune. Her fingers danced across the keys with a cheerful energy, creating a sense of movement and life that made people smile quietly. The music brought laughter and a sense of ease, balancing the intensity of the earlier melodies. Listeners found themselves tapping subtly to the rhythm. Drawn into the joyous atmosphere, she noticed a young man near the back, initially uninterested, now leaning forward, completely engaged. His expression was one of surprise and delight, his eyes following each note. She felt a quiet thrill, realizing that her music could reach and affect people who had not expected to be touched by it. The piano had become her voice, speaking in a language that everyone understood, yet no one had to define. Time seemed to stretch as she played, minutes blending seamlessly into longer stretches of sound. She became aware of the sunlight shifting through the windows, casting moving patterns across the room and the piano. The light, combined with the music, created an almost cinematic effect, making the moment feel timeless and special. She allowed herself to sink into the feeling. Aware that this experience was rare and precious, she began to improvise slightly, letting her intuition guide the melodies. Each movement of her hands brought new harmonies, subtle changes in tempo, and playful embellishments. The audience responded unconsciously, leaning in, their faces reflecting wonder and admiration. She realized that the more she trusted herself and the music, the more the room responded, the more alive the space became. A gentle smile spread across her face as she continued to play. The music was no longer about performance or skill alone. It was about expression, about sharing a part of herself in a way that words could not capture. She thought about all the quiet hours she had spent practicing alone, the small victories and frustrations, and now in this room, that effort was blooming into something tangible, something that touched others. She noticed that the people in the room were no longer simply observers. They were participants in the experience, absorbing the nuances, reacting subtly to changes in rhythm, volume, and emotion. The music created a rhythm of connection, an invisible thread linking everyone to the piano and to each other. She felt a profound sense of belonging, not just in the room, but in the act of creating and sharing something beautiful. As she played the final notes of her playful piece, the room seemed to exhale collectively, a shared release of emotion and appreciation. There was a moment of silence, filled with unspoken admiration and awe. She lifted her hands from the keys slowly, feeling the lingering resonance of the music both in the room and within herself. The hush that followed was meaningful, a quiet acknowledgement of what had just occurred. Soft claps began to ripple through the audience, small at first, then growing as more people joined. She felt a warm flush of satisfaction, but kept her composure, letting the music speak more than words ever could. People whispered compliments to each other, exchanging comments about the depth and beauty of the performance. She felt the genuine admiration, untainted by exaggeration or expectation. a pure response to the music she had shared. She realized that the evening had transformed in a way she had not anticipated. What had started as a casual suggestion to play for fun had become an experience that held everyone's attention and hearts. The room felt lighter, more connected, and filled with an energy that was almost palpable. The music had done more than fill space. It had created a shared memory, a moment that each person present would carry in their minds long after leaving. She looked around the room, taking in the faces and expressions, feeling a quiet pride. There was no need for grand gestures or formal recognition. The simple act of sharing her music had brought people together, made them pause, and touched them in ways words could not. She felt grateful for the opportunity, for the invitation, and for the courage to sit at the piano and let the music flow. As she gently closed the final piece, the room remained calm for just a heartbeat longer, savoring the echo of the notes. Then the soft murmur of conversation resumed, more lively and warm than before, infused with the afterglow of the music. She smiled, realizing that the connection she had felt was not fleeting. It had created a bridge between her and the people, something real and enduring, built on shared experience and emotion. And in that moment, she knew that playing for fun had become something far more meaningful than she had ever expected. She felt a subtle shift in herself as she continued playing. The confidence that had begun to grow in the last pieces now deepened into something stronger. Her fingers moved freely across the keys, almost as if the piano had become a part of her, an extension of her own thoughts and feelings. The room around her seemed to fade into a gentle blur, leaving only the music and the connection it created between her and the people listening as she began her next melody. The sound took on a more emotional tone. It was soft at first, gentle waves of harmony rolling through the air, but it soon grew more expressive, richer, more textured. She played with a sensitivity that made each note linger longer than expected, resonating deep within the hearts of the listeners. A hush fell over the room, not a forced silence, but one born naturally from the power of her music. Even those who had been chatting earlier had become fully attentive. Captivated by the unexpected beauty, she noticed subtle changes in her audience. A young woman sitting near the corner had her hand on her chest, her eyes slightly moist, as though the music had stirred a memory or emotion. An older man leaned forward, elbows on his knees, completely absorbed in the melody, his expression reflecting awe and concentration. Every listener responded differently, yet collectively, they were united by the music, a silent shared experience that seemed to suspend time for a moment. The melody began to shift, rising and falling in a delicate pattern that seemed almost like breathing. She let herself be carried along by the rhythm, following instinct rather than strict notes, allowing her emotions to guide her fingers. The room became completely attuned to her playing. The energy of the music felt almost tangible, wrapping around everyone present like a gentle embrace. The sound filled every corner, bouncing softly off the walls and ceiling, as though the space itself wanted to hold the music. She realized that she was no longer playing for herself, or even for approval. She was playing for the room, for the people, for the shared moment that had emerged spontaneously. Every note she struck seemed to speak, convey an emotion without words. Her eyes remained mostly on the keys, but occasionally she allowed a glance toward the audience. The expression she saw reflected surprise, admiration, and a kind of quiet wonder. They were witnessing something genuine and heartfelt, something that couldn't be replicated or faked. A soft hum of appreciation began to ripple through the group. Subtle but noticeable. People shifted slightly, adjusting their posture, leaning in to listen more closely. She could sense their engagement, and it gave her a new surge of energy. Her fingers danced lightly, then pressed firmly when the music demanded strength, creating contrasts that made the performance even more compelling. She had entered a flow state, fully immersed. Forgetting herself and embracing the music completely, the melody began to take on a more intense, passionate quality. It moved through the spectrum of emotions, from tender and delicate to bold and powerful. She played with an awareness of the silence between the notes, letting each pause carry meaning. The room, already captivated, responded unconsciously. Breaths held, movements slowed, faces reflecting the impact of the music. It was as if time itself had been altered by the sound she produced. She began to introduce subtle variations and embellishments, little flourishes that enhanced the emotion of the piece without drawing attention to technical skill. Each note seemed deliberate and personal, revealing her own interpretation and feeling. The audience was no longer merely listening, they were experiencing, absorbed in a journey that was being created right in front of them. Eyes followed her hands, but their minds were carried along with the music, experiencing its highs and lows in a profoundly intimate way. She paused briefly, letting a chord resonate fully, and noticed the room holding its collective breath. The silence was heavy, filled with anticipation. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was a shared acknowledgement of the power of the music. Then she resumed, moving into a passage that was both complex and lyrical, her fingers navigating the keys with elegance and precision. Every movement was thoughtful yet natural, a reflection of her understanding of the instrument and her emotional connection to it. As the melody swelled, she could feel the room vibrating with attention. People leaned closer, captivated by the shifts in tone, tempo, and emotion. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound fill them completely. She realized that her playing had reached a level where the music was larger than herself, a force that touched everyone in the room in unique ways. She smiled faintly, amazed at the effect a single performance could have, even in such an informal setting. The music became more dramatic, with rising chords and intricate passages that demanded careful focus. She relished the challenge, allowing herself to explore the dynamics fully. Her hands moved with a blend of confidence and care, expressing not just the notes, but the emotion behind them. She could feel her heartbeats synchronizing with the rhythm, the energy flowing between her and the room in a subtle, almost magical exchange. A few people leaned in subtly, their faces reflecting a mixture of admiration and disbelief. They whispered to each other, exchanging glances that communicated unspoken amazement. One person's eyes glistened with emotion, and she noticed, without breaking her focus on the piano, the music had created a shared intimacy, a bond that didn't require words or explanation. She felt deeply grateful for the moment, realizing that her performance was touching people in ways she had never imagined. She transitioned smoothly into a softer passage, a reflective and introspective melody that contrasted with the intensity of the previous section. The room seemed to exhale along with her, the energy settling into a calm, attentive state. She allowed herself to feel each note fully, the sound resonating both in the space and within her. The audience remained silent, fully immersed, each person experiencing the music in their own personal way. She felt their engagement, and it inspired her to continue exploring the depth and nuance of each phrase. Her hands moved effortlessly now, the nervousness that had accompanied her at the beginning completely gone. Every gesture was purposeful, every note chosen with care and feeling. She could sense the room leaning with her music, the collective focus creating a shared experience that was rare and precious. The interplay of light and shadow in the room, combined with the shifting chords, made the atmosphere almost cinematic. Enhancing the emotional resonance of the performance, she introduced a gentle rhythm, a flowing pattern that carried a sense of movement and life. The listeners followed instinctively, their attention fully captured by the music. Some swayed slightly, others tapped fingers lightly, all responding unconsciously to the cadence. She felt a deep sense of connection, understanding that the power of music lay not in complexity alone, but in its ability to touch hearts and minds directly. The intensity built gradually, every note adding to the emotional crescendo. She felt her breath syncing with the music, each exhale guiding the softer phrases, each inhale preparing for the more forceful passages. The room was fully alive with attention, yet quiet, a shared stillness that amplified the impact of every chord. She played with vulnerability, exposing emotion through her fingers, and the audience responded with equal openness. She glanced around subtly, noticing the expressions of awe and wonder. Faces were attentive, some smiling softly, others reflecting contemplation or emotion stirred by the melodies. The connection was profound, a silent communication between performer and audience that transcended spoken language. She felt a swell of pride, not for herself, but for the beauty of the moment and the shared human experience unfolding before her. The music began to soften, slowing slightly, becoming more contemplative. She allowed the notes to linger, filling the space with warmth and depth. Each chord carried intention, each pause held meaning. The listeners remained still, attentive, as if afraid to break the spell. She realized that the performance had grown far beyond casual fun. It had become a moment of genuine human connection, a rare gift of emotion and presence shared with those around her as she approached the final section of the piece. The melody rose one last time, powerful yet graceful. Sweeping through the room with authority and beauty, she played with a mix of strength and delicacy, allowing the music to flow naturally. The audience leaned in collectively, their engagement absolute, as though they had been drawn into a new world created entirely by sound. The experience felt intimate, almost sacred. It shared among all present. The final notes lingered, resonating in the air, leaving a lasting impression of beauty and emotion. She lifted her hands slowly from the keys, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment and awe. The room remained silent for a brief moment, the weight of what had just occurred settling over everyone. Then, softly at first, then more audibly, came the murmurs of admiration, the whispers of appreciation. In the quiet acknowledgement of the power of her performance, she looked up, surprised by the intensity of the attention. The casual atmosphere of the gathering had transformed completely. The room was now full of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. She felt a rush of emotion herself, humbled by the response and grateful for the opportunity to share her music. The experience was no longer about casual fun. It was about connection, expression, and the impact one person could have through dedication, emotion, and courage. She felt the room leaning into her music as she began the next piece. This time she chose a melody that carried more weight, a tune that had always moved her deeply when she played it alone. Her fingers caressed the keys, each note deliberate and full of emotion. The music started softly, almost whispering, and gradually built, layering intensity with a quiet urgency that drew the audience in. The faces around her reflected the growing depth of the performance. Eyes widened, some glistening with unspoken emotion. There were subtle shifts in posture as listeners leaned forward, captivated by the unfolding story within the notes. She played not just with skill but with heart, and the room responded in kind. Every listener absorbed in the music as if it were speaking directly to them. The melody rose, intricate and expressive, flowing through the air like a river of sound. She allowed herself to follow the music wherever it led, improvising gently, letting the rhythm and harmony guide her fingers. The room seemed to pulse in response, the collective focus almost tangible. She could feel the weight of attention, but it did not intimidate her. Instead, it encouraged her to play more freely, more boldly. A few people had tears in their eyes now, subtle and quiet, but unmistakable. The emotional power of the music was reaching them in ways words could never. She noticed the young woman in the corner, clutching her hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the beauty of the melody. The older man near the piano had a soft, awed smile, his attention unwavering. Even those who had been skeptical or indifferent at the start were now completely absorbed. She shifted the melody, introducing richer chords and more complex passages. The music became more dramatic, carrying waves of emotion that rose and fell naturally. Her hands moved fluidly, confident in every motion, as if the piano and her were one entity expressing feelings beyond language. The room vibrated with the resonance of sound, each note striking a chord in the hearts of her listeners. The dynamics of the piece varied, from quiet, reflective moments to powerful, soaring crescendos. She let herself feel every note, allowing her own emotions to guide the intensity and phrasing. The audience responded instinctively, leaning in, holding their breath during the softer sections, and exhaling with awe during the louder, more passionate passages. The shared experience created a connection so profound that it was almost visible in the room. Her eyes occasionally flicked up, catching glimpses of the reactions around her. Faces that had been casual now mirrored the depth and nuance of her music. Some were smiling softly, some had tears glistening, and some simply stared, lost in thought. The room itself seemed to respond, the sound bouncing off the walls and ceiling, filling every space and creating an almost tangible aura of emotion. She reached a particularly intense passage, her fingers moving rapidly, yet gracefully, weaving layers of sound that carried both urgency and elegance. The room felt electric with anticipation, every listener caught in the ebb and flow of her music. Even without words, the narrative of the piece was clear. It spoke of longing, hope, struggle, and triumph, emotions everyone could recognize and feel. The melody shifted again, moving into a softer, more reflective section. She allowed the notes to linger, each one resonating fully before the next. The room held its collective breath, enraptured, as though the music had frozen time for a brief moment. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the performance had transcended casual entertainment and had become a deeply moving experience for everyone present. As she continued, the intensity built toward a final emotional peak. The chords grew richer, the harmonies more intricate, the rhythm more compelling. She played with passion, yet with control, channeling every ounce of feeling into the music. The audience felt it, each person swept up in the crescendo, hearts beating in quiet harmony with the notes. The power of the moment was almost overwhelming. The connection between performer and listeners, undeniable. Some listeners whispered softly, sharing their awe and amazement with each other. Faces reflected a range of emotions, joy, nostalgia, wonder, even tears, but all were united in admiration for the music. She felt the impact of her performance ripple through the room, a wave of emotion and appreciation that was both humbling and exhilarating. The music had become larger than herself, shared experience that touched everyone present. The final passage approached, and she allowed herself to sink fully into the expression of the piece. Each chord carried meaning, each note conveyed emotion. She felt the room responding, the energy of the audience amplifying the intensity of the music. Her hands moved with precision and freedom, guided by both technique and feeling. The melody reached its climax, powerful and sweeping, filling the space completely, leaving the listeners breathless. As the last notes lingered, a profound silence settled over the room. The sound faded slowly, leaving only the echo in the hearts and minds of those who had listened. She lifted her hands from the keys gently, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The audience remained still for a heartbeat longer, savoring the final resonance of the music. Then, quietly at first, came murmurs of admiration. Soft applause that grew steadily as people expressed their awe and appreciation. She looked up, catching the expressions around her, and felt a deep sense of humility and joy. The casual gathering had transformed into a space of shared emotion and human connection, a moment that none present would soon forget. She smiled faintly, realizing that the music had not only moved the audience, but it also moved her in ways she had not anticipated. It was a rare, beautiful moment of vulnerability and authenticity, a reminder of the power of art to connect and uplift. People began to speak softly to each other, their words tinged with wonder and amazement. Some shared how the music had touched them personally, recalling memories and emotions stirred by the performance. She listened quietly, grateful for the impact she had been able to create without intention beyond sharing her love of music. The experience reinforced her belief in the simple yet profound truth that genuine expression could touch hearts in ways nothing else could. The room buzzed with a gentle energy, an afterglow of the shared experience. She remained seated at the piano for a few moments longer, letting the silence settle and appreciating the reactions around her. The performance had reached a level beyond casual fun. It had become a moment of beauty, connection, and profound human experience. She knew that this night and the way the music had united everyone would stay with her forever. As the audience continued to express admiration, she felt a mixture of pride, humility, and gratitude. The power of the music to move people so deeply, to create a shared emotional experience, had surprised her. She realized that the simplest invitation to play for fun had led to one of the most significant moments of her life. The performance had touched not only the audience, but also herself, reminding her of why she played music in the first place: to connect, to express, and to share something true and meaningful. She let her hands rest lightly on the keys after the final performance. The room still filled with the lingering resonance of her music. A soft, collective sigh passed through the audience, followed by gentle applause, hesitant at first and then growing steadily. She looked up, meeting the eyes of those around her, and felt a warm sense of connection she had never experienced before. The music had done more than entertain. It had created a shared emotional space, a bond between her and every listener. People began to approach her, one by one, offering quiet compliments and words of admiration. A few described how the melodies had touched them, reminding them of memories long forgotten or emotions they had not fully acknowledged in years. Others were astonished at the skill and natural expression she had displayed, especially given the casual nature of the gathering. She smiled, listening intently, grateful for the authenticity of their reactions. There was no exaggeration, no pretense, only genuine appreciation. She reflected on how hesitant she had felt when first invited to play. The nervousness that had fluttered in her chest seemed like a distant memory now. What had started as a casual suggestion to play for fun had grown into something far more profound. The room had become a stage, the music a bridge connecting hearts, and she had been the vessel for it. She realized that her willingness to embrace the moment, despite initial self-doubt, had created an unforgettable experience for everyone present. A small circle formed around her as people continued to speak softly, sharing their thoughts and feelings. Some disquieted how they had never expected to be so moved by a casual piano performance, while others marveled at the depth of emotion